Start recording. I don't know if you heard that, but Jason's not going to be able to join the meeting this evening. He had another commitment, so you can get started anytime that you would like.
Yeah, well, let's start with, I think I heard a little bit of the tail end of the conversation when I logged onto the Zoom, but I didn't receive any agenda from the office. Was there an agenda put together for this or not? I know sometimes we've done that in the past and sometimes we haven't.
No, there wasn't any agenda. We just had the two items from before that Mr. Deegan had mentioned.
Yeah, and which two items have been discussed so far? Because I know Rusty mentioned another one. Which two items are you referencing?
The ones I referenced in the email were the effects of like how health care agencies, FQHCs, LBHCs handle, the realm of medical marijuana being in those spaces. I don't know if I'm really explaining that right, but that's something that's been discussed before, where there's been questions that people have. Are there any national recommendations for our hospitals and different health facilities? And then the second one was, how does law enforcement determine impairment, if at all, when it comes to medical marijuana? What constitutes driving under the influence, or where do we go? How do we handle those kinds of issues? I think is what I've had people ask me, those kind of questions.
Okay. And then Rusty, what did you mention?
I was under the impression that the topic of discussion for this evening's meeting was reciprocity. I know that's what we discussed at the last meeting of the full board.
Right. I remember that at the last full board meeting, there was a discussion of reciprocity, and we were going to bring that up. There's also been, I know in the past, discussions about how to handle the impairment issue that Joe's mentioning. And then with the health facilities, I guess that really goes to what standards or protocols they would have in place to deal with people who are also medical cannabis users. Is that your understanding, Joe? Or am I missing what that item is?
You mean as far as impairment? You're talking about that?
No, I'm sorry. I flipped back to the first one. So the health facilities, would that be how they treat patients that are also medical cannabis users? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think it's a variety of things. I think it's okay if somebody comes in, is on a hospital floor, and they have a medical cannabis card, and they have possession of medical cannabis on a medical floor, or they have I'm not sure, there's not, smoking is not allowed in hospitals, period. But does our pharmacy, what protections can pharmacies at a hospital, or how do institutions that have patients that have the cannabis card handle the variety of different issues that may arise? And I've just cited the ones that I can think of, and I think others have mentioned, and there's some folks probably from West Virginia University. I've known we've been on a call with some folks from WVU that have like some protocols in place, but we just don't have recommendations out there that we can give to healthcare facilities to give them some direction. Yeah, basically. That was one of the, that was an issue that we'd been on our sidebar agenda months ago.
That's what I thought. That was one we had talked about a while back. I wonder if, I know we have a limited amount of time this evening. I think, Joe, is it you that you have a 6:30, another meeting starting,
I
right?
have I basically chair a self-help AA meeting.
Sure.
I gotta
Sure.
go.
So here's what I'm wondering. I mean, we've got basically three issues we need to deal with. So we've got this health facilities issue, this impairment issue, and then the reciprocity issue that I know we mentioned at the last board meeting that we would at least talk about this evening and hear from people on. What I'm wondering is, for the health facilities, number one, should we get some speakers like you're talking about, the WVU people or whoever you've talked to that have some protocols in place to maybe give us how they handle it at, for instance, their hospitals, so that we could talk about, is that something we ought to make a recommendation to the full board about adopting protocols on, or whether that's even under our purview, whether it's something we really are supposed to put out there. I know that, there's other agencies that regulate the hospitals, so I don't want to step on any toes either. But I guess what I'm wondering is, how does everybody feel about maybe making that an agenda item and bringing some speakers in on it for the next meeting, and then we could try to take up the impairment issue and the reciprocity issue, some discussion tonight. I think the impairment issue also, probably what might be helpful would be to have law enforcement, and we could probably talk to the Colonel Cahill about maybe having someone from the state police come give us some guidance of how they're addressing that right now. I know from a criminal defense lawyer standpoint, I've done a lot of DUI work over the years. I know generally how they handle that, and I know that we don't have any kind of standard in place at this point in terms of nanograms in the blood or anything like that. I know certain states have looked at that. Maybe we ought to have law enforcement speak to us about how they are handling impairment with driving. I know it's actually in some ways it's a little more difficult to deal with than alcohol. Alcohol, you can take the test and show, are they above 0.08 or not. There really isn't any good frame of reference right now for marijuana, and it stays in systems for so long that I think it's very difficult to establish some number. But maybe we could have them speak to us. I don't know. The more I talk about it, maybe maybe those are two items we need outside speakers for. But what does everybody else think? When I say everybody else, I'm talking about the other board members. I know we got a lot of people on the call.
Speaking to the issue of impairment, when I've traveled to legal states and made it a point to speak with law enforcement officers who are, dealing with this right now, both in recreationally legal states and medically legal states. And from what I'm being told, the reason that we don't know or we don't have a baseline as far as nanograms in the blood is because that's pretty impossible to do. The endocannabinoid system in your body versus the endocannabinoid system in my body are completely different things. Weight comes into effect if someone that weighs 100 pounds versus someone that weighs 200 pounds, those levels of THC, if you've got 8 or whatever it is, 100 nanograms in your system and you weigh 100 pounds, and you've got 100 nanograms of it in your system and you weigh 200 pounds, it affects people very differently. And there's also the point, which I found very interesting. I talked with a law enforcement officer out in California who said that when you're talking with a cancer patient, right? Like, for instance, when I was going through my treatments, I was fortunate. I had rides to and from treatment. I didn't have to drive myself to the hospital. But for somebody who was leaving the hospital after having chemotherapy, once that Zofran and once the nausea medicine wears off that you're given in the IVs, you're not safe on the road. Knowing that cannabis can take those side effects away immediately, the officer that I spoke with said that in some cases like that, the driver is actually safer after having used cannabis. So I do think that we need to not just talk with law enforcement officers, but if we're going to have that discussion, we need to invite law enforcement officers in the states that have been dealing with this. California has been medically legal since 1996. Their officers are very well versed in dealing with patients on cannabis. So I'm open to continuing that discussion, but I don't think anyone in this particular work group has the expertise to make any sort of definitive recommendation based on the subject of impairment.
And I'll tell you, just following up on that, I think there's no downside to having both folks from here and folks from states that have already invented this wheel do this. But I will tell you, in my experience defending people who have been accused of driving under the influence of marijuana, it is much more difficult currently in West Virginia to defend those cases than it is an alcohol case, because there is no set standard. And so what ends up happening is that with an alcohol case, if someone admits to having a couple of drinks or doesn't admit to it and the officer smells alcohol, they can do a breath test or a blood test, and you can get a level that tells you if you're under or not, or over the legal limit. There's nothing for that with respect to cannabis. And so what happens is that the officer's personal observations are often enough. And if you have someone who admittedly is a cannabis user, and then the officer's observations are such that they say, well, they appeared to be under the influence, or they do the AROD test, they call it. It's different protocols than a normal field sobriety test, and it's supposed to measure different categories of things that they can observe. They have to be trained, specific officers can observe. It becomes almost completely subjective to that particular officer as to whether or not they're going to say they're under the influence. And then it's very difficult to defend those cases. And I'm not suggesting if someone is under the influence, then they're supposed to be convicted of doing that. But this becomes very much a judgment call, which is not what we have in the alcohol world. And that's why we have set standards. But to your point, it's really difficult to set a standard in the cannabis world because everyone's affected differently. If you're a habitual user of it, it's going to build up in your system, and you may have something in your system that day and haven't used the product in 24 hours. But it's a conversation that we probably as a board need to decide, are we going to make some recommendations to the legislature on that one way or the other? And so my thought is we ought to get some law enforcement people that are on the front lines dealing with this, maybe from here to explain what they're doing, and maybe from another state that's already established as to how they're dealing with it. I know there was a big push in Colorado to put in some nanogram levels years ago. So I'd be interested to hear what either they or California or whomever's dealt with this, what they're doing. It may be that if we speak with the state police here, they might have information from those other agencies already as to what they're, how they're making those determinations. Right. So I guess my suggestion would be is that we table the impairment discussion and invite speakers for the next work group meeting, and that we get that done. I know that this meeting got scheduled. I will tell you, I've been out of town and extraordinarily busy, and I was running all day today until right at 5 o'clock to get on this meeting. I'd like to have it where we set up and we know exactly what's going to be on the agenda for the next meeting ahead of time, and we can put an agenda together and where we have a full 2 hours, and we can line up those speakers and deal with that. So I guess my suggestion would be is that we place impairment on our next meeting agenda. Given that, what is so start with Rusty. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's fine. I also do think it's important to know that, again, I think that, and this isn't just my opinion, this also came from a law enforcement officer I talked to out in Colorado when I was out in Colorado Springs. And when I asked about how they were dealing with impairment, his verbatim response was, why would we reinvent the wheel? He said, if the field sobriety test is sufficient enough to determine if someone is under the influence, whether it be pills, whether it be hard drugs like cocaine or heroin or any of the sort, he said, if the field sobriety test is good enough to determine someone is too impaired to drive a car, then the substance doesn't really make a difference. So I worry that we're going to get in the weeds on something that, other states aren't really addressing.
I will tell you that the alcohol field sobriety tests have generally been shown to not be effective with respect to certain substances. And that's why they developed the AROD test, because there are serious issues with, for instance, horizontal gaze nystagmus. You don't necessarily get this nystagmus from various drugs. You get it from alcohol. So that's one of the standard field sobriety tests that's out the window. So you run into, at least the way it's been, and I've had a lot of DUI cases where I've had experts testify to this stuff. They developed A-RIDE because the underlying field sobriety tests were not reliable and were never designed for cannabis or for other drugs. They were designed to detect alcohol. And so there's serious issues about that. But I think what we really need is, I mean, I can anecdotally talk about what people have testified to in cases I've had. You can talk about cops you've talked to. Joe could tell us about, folks coming into the hospital. These are all anecdotes. I think we need people that actually have expertise that can tell us how these things work. I mean, I've picked them apart a lot, and so I can tell you a lot about that, but that's not the same as someone that has been certified and trained nationally and can explain those differences. And, maybe we reach out to the NHTSA folks, the National Highway Safety folks, that certify these tests, and let them, maybe someone from their group could speak to us. So, I think if we start with the state police, talk to Cahill, who's on this board, about getting, some speakers lined up. That's going to be helpful. And let's try to, address that impairment issue. And then we can make a decision about whether we want to make a recommendation. It may be that we want to make a recommendation to the legislature ultimately, or at least to the full board, and then to the legislature about changing some of those laws. But, that's something I think we need more information on. Joe, what do you think?
No, I think so. I think we need to bring in Colonel Cahill and, Rusty may know some people that he can talk to, and I may, be able to find some people that can talk, about what they've experienced in some of those other states, and we can have a, couple speakers at the next policy meeting and go from there.
All right.
And
So
just focus on the impairment issue first, and then cover the, we can get some feedback and at that same next meeting, say, okay, here's some potential speakers to speak to the health facility issue at a meeting down the road, in 2022.
All right. So let's say then that we're going to place the impairment issue for the next meeting of this group. And then let's table health facilities for now. Maybe we'll place that at a following meeting, because I don't want to get, I want to have enough time I think that impairment issue is something that really needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later anyway, if the legislature is going to do something with it. So, all right, so let's make impairment for the next meeting. Let's table health facilities for right now. And let's go ahead and talk about, to the extent we can, let's talk about reciprocity this evening, because I know we told the full board we would address that. So let's try to address the reciprocity issue. I don't know, if who wants to jump in and go first on that. I know it was an issue that Rusty's brought up and been active on. So it's fine by me if he wants to take the lead on talking about that, or Joe, if you have a position you want to get out there first, that's fine by me too.
Yeah, to me, this is a very simple issue to deal with. We've got, from the last number that I was made aware of, we've got just around 6,000 certified patients, and as of now, 3 dispensaries statewide open. And we've got Ohio, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia all have medical cannabis programs that are in operation. And I think that if we have the ability to enter into reciprocity agreements with our bordering states and allow patients to go and get safe access to their medicine, then this is, to me, it's a no-brainer. I've talked with dispensary owners who they're looking at this from the other side of the issue. It's once their operations are up and running at full capacity, it's also going to allow patients from out of state to come here and use their medical cards in our dispensary system, which is just going to make the industry more money and facilitate better patient access. And to me, the only thing this board should be doing is to working to facilitate better patient access, and reciprocity, especially at the rate that dispensaries are opening and at the rate that this program is being implemented. This could solve a problem and get medicine into people's hands pretty much immediately. And I just think that This is something reciprocity should have been included in the original language that the legislature passed. Was very disappointed to see that the only patients they were taking into consideration were terminal cancer patients. That's what statute dictates now. And, to me, it's a no-brainer. Maryland already, someone just put it in the chat, and that's, Maryland already accepts out-of-state cards. I'm sure entering into a reciprocity agreement with Maryland should be pretty easy. I'm not sure what Ohio's status is on reciprocity. I know Pennsylvania has entered into reciprocity agreements, but to me, again, I don't know if you guys are talking to a lot of the people on the business end, but what I'm hearing from them is not good. I'm hearing folks are hesitant to really kick it in gear and get these facilities open, because right now the patient count is so low, there's no financial incentive for them to do it. They're going to lose money. And unless you're a big multi-state operator with tons of bank and you can afford to lose for a couple years, these people aren't really inclined to go in business. So again, we're leaving patients high and dry when they could drive right across the state lines, get their medicine at a legal regulated dispensary in from a legal program and get some relief. And again, to me, it's a no-brainer.
I know we don't have Jason on tonight, so I guess we're not gonna be able to get sort of the department's position on this right now. Joe, did you want to chime in at all?
Well, I guess that's where I think we do need Jason, to give some feedback. I don't know that, do we have reciprocity with other medications with a script? Do we have, it may be legal in medical marijuana, but it's still a controlled substance, so that's where I would have heartburn. I don't know, it's just I think we need, again, we may need some speakers that are experienced with this in other states, and see what.
So I think that gets into that sort of difference between the federal and the state issue, because I think, and I'm no expert in it, but I think the way that generally flows with physicians is because they have a DEA certification, they can prescribe, and that the pharmacies across the country will recognize that prescription. And obviously with this type of stuff, until Congress does something different with it, we're not going to have a federal license to prescribe these types of things. In fact, they're not prescriptions at all. So I guess it almost becomes more like the firearm reciprocities. Do you acknowledge a concealed carry permit that in various states? And I know, for instance, West Virginia has reciprocity with a number of states. There are certain states that we've not had reciprocity with, or don't have reciprocity on their concealed carry for firearms. But I think it becomes a little more along those lines than it does the typical, doctor prescribes an opioid, for instance, because that's, I think, where that's done under a DEA certification or license, that it's recognized at other pharmacies. I don't, not having the department's position is a little difficult. We really probably need to know where they're at with this. The other states, Maryland's now allowing this from what I've read. The last I read, Ohio still did not, but that could have changed. And then, as Rusty just pointed out, I guess Pennsylvania is now allowing it. I hadn't seen that yet, but it certainly, from an industry standpoint, I'll tell you, anecdotally, the folks that are in the industry that I'm talking to are saying the same things. That you're talking about 6,000 patients that have registered at this point, and that's not a sustainable industry to expand and to be able to sustain itself and employ people and do that. And I understand that our role ultimately here is to provide patient access. It's not this medical cannabis is not designed as a business. It's designed to try to help patients ultimately. But the practical reality is that in order to do that, these folks that have gotten the licenses and these companies that are involved in it and employing West Virginians have to have a market, or it's never gonna be there to give other patients access. And I don't know if that's something that we need additional movements from the office. I know the Office of Medical Cannabis has held recruiting events around the state to make sure people are informed on how to sign up. But I don't know if we need additional work in that regard. Certainly having out-of-state reciprocity, you would expect that would open up to additional sales for these companies, which would then make sure that there is patient access for our West Virginia cancer patients and people that are going through this stuff. So, I would think that if we can figure out a way to do this for concealed carry firearms, there ought to be a way to do this for folks that have medical cannabis cards. And it may be that it's got to be done on a state by state basis, which I think the reciprocity for a lot of different things is professional licensors. Those are things that agencies look at on a state by state basis. Maybe it's a matter of our Office of Medical Cannabis having to look at Pennsylvania's requirements, making sure they're similar to something that we do, so that we don't end up with I know that historically, before California was recreational, you'd hear the anecdotes of, people could walk through Venice Beach and get certified in 5 minutes that they had a medical condition and they get a card. And, that's very different from the process that our legislature put in place, whether you agree with it or not. It's just very different. And so, maybe it's something where we need to have, our office look at other states that have similar requirements to what we do, so that we can at least get reciprocity with those, even if there isn't potentially an appetite in the legislature to do reciprocity with all states. But I think this is something that is important. It's also important that, people are living all over the place right now. I mean, I go to Snowshoe in West Virginia quite a bit because I've got kids in a ski program there. And when you're up there and you're talking to people, there's a lot of people from Washington, D.C. that during the pandemic set up there. And they may not have, those are the types of folks that may not have citizenship within the state, but maybe some of them have health conditions and may have their own cards or something like that. I don't know that, but I'm just using that as an example that we have places in West Virginia that we can draw people into from out of state. And I would hope that them being able to get something that they believe is medically necessary to help some kind of condition for them wouldn't prevent them from coming in here. And so, I mean, I think this is something that would help industry and ultimately help patients, and also potentially help, our ability in a state whose population is dwindling to attract people to come here. So, from that, from my view, I think there's got to be a way to do this and to do it responsibly. But I do think we need to hear from the Office of Medical Cannabis, probably hear, whether they've got a position on this, and also whether they could compile something for us that would tell us other states that have similar requirements to what we have, so we could at least get the ball rolling with those states. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Like how does this work, in other states, and if they've researched it to some level to be able to give us some guidance.
Yeah, I just hope that we can expedite it. My thing is, I don't use the word lightly, but we have patients that are literally suffering right now. And I know patients who live in Morgantown who have access to the dispensary. One patient, for instance, went in, bought flour. It was his second visit. The first strain he bought didn't work for him, didn't help his condition. So he went back and bought another strain, and it did. It really worked for him. And then when he went back a third time to get more, they don't have it anymore. That strain is gone. And, I'm just really concerned with not just the slow rollout, but what patients are dealing with here, unnecessarily. I truly believe that if our charge is to facilitate the best patient access and immediate patient access, I think that pushing for reciprocity, pushing this discussion, and also pushing the discussion surrounding home grow are the two most crucial conversations that this board could be having right now. You know, with the home grow situation, for instance, with the patient in Morgantown that found a strain that worked for him, and now the dispensaries don't have it anymore. Had he been able to buy a couple clones from the dispensary, you know, so they would have been in the seed to sale tracking system, just like all the other products, he could grow a strain that works, that he knows works. You know, so I completely support your idea of, you know, getting some information together and having a broader conversation on the issue of reciprocity. I don't want us to wait, you know, another 2-3 months, because patients, they need access. We need to be doing this stuff as quickly as we possibly can. So that's my only thoughts on it. I agree. We do need more information. I don't want to wait, you know.
Hey, Rusty, you've got more of a, you know, thumb on this than probably the rest of us on this board. Has the legislature addressed any of this during this session?
Nope. Legislature hasn't addressed anything cannabis related at all. We had a bill that would have put added edibles back into statute as an acceptable method of delivery, and it died in the House Judiciary Committee last week. So as of right now, none of the cannabis bills are moving. Crossover day is Wednesday, so it's nothing is going to happen this legislative session, and that's very disappointing to see that this program was signed into law 5 years ago, and the political will to see to it that it works and to see to it that patients have access to a alternative to these pharmaceuticals, the political will is just not there, and it's very disappointing. I've had patients reach out to me and they ask, you know, what do I do? What do I do? And as much as I hate to, I tell them, if they have the means, move to a state where politicians actually care, because here they don't. That's the bottom line in it. You know, this is not, there's so much partisan bickering up there at the legislature, and from a patient's point of view, it's really disgusting when they throw cannabis into that partisan barrel, because cancer never asked me one time if I was a Republican or Democrat or what my political affiliation was. And these patients that are suffering across the state, you know, they're dealing with the same thing. There's Republicans with cancer, just like there as many Democrats. So unfortunately, the political will is just not there.
I guess one of the reasons I asked, I mean, it's, you know, obviously as a board, ultimately we make recommendations from a subgroup to the full board, and then the full board's authority is to make recommendations to the governor and the legislature. And so I just wanted to make sure there wasn't something imminent that was up there, because, you know, not that, I mean, I agree with you that we need to move swiftly on these topics, but in all likelihood, we're talking about this is not something that's going to happen during this session of the legislature, which is going to end in a few weeks.
Yeah, to me, it would make more sense. I know that we make our recommendations to the legislature, but to me, it would make more sense to make our recommendations directly to Governor Justice. Governor Justice does support medical cannabis. He does believe in the program, and he believes in the medical efficacy of this plant. And, you know, maybe if we made our recommendations directly to the executive, maybe he could help push these through the legislature, because again, patients are suffering and they don't need to be.
Well, I know
39 other states do this. I mean, the fact that we go back and try to reinvent the wheel on every single topic relating to medical cannabis as a patient is extremely frustrating.
I know that our initial findings were directed both to the governor as well as to the legislature. And I would expect and think that any further recommendations we make would be directed to both as well. So those are things that, you know, if anyone wants to take up to the executive branch, they should be able to do that. I mean, obviously the Office of Medical Cannabis is under DHHR, which is under the executive branch. So, but I think our recommendations, and I think our role is to make any recommendations we may have both to the governor and to the legislature. But it does sound like we probably need a little more information on what other states are doing with respect to reciprocity, and then also what their protocols are to issue the cards that, you know, there may be states that it's just almost a no-brainer. I mean, I would expect, given that what I know about just Pennsylvania's, for instance, that we modeled much of our law off of that originally, and you would expect that knowing that their process for certification would be similar, and therefore it might make sense for us to have reciprocity with a border state like Pennsylvania, where you're going to have people coming back and forth all the time, and we would have a similar, similar criteria for how our cards are issued. I would think that would be something that would be fairly simple, but I do think we need the office to do a little research for us on that. Crystal, I know you're on the line. Jason can't be on tonight. Is that something you could note that we as a subgroup have asked that the Office of Medical Cannabis put together some information on reciprocity and on other states' criteria for the medical cannabis cards, so that we can have a more informed discussion about what other states do with respect to reciprocity and other states that are similar to us, so we could, if we're making recommendations, maybe we could initially at least make recommendations that we have a reciprocity process with, certain states that are similar to us.
Yes, I've made note of that, and we will follow up on that. I will just say, Rusty, with the recommendations that the MCAB does, you do make, they do go to legislative leadership and to the governor's office. So they are introduced there. I asked about the office stance on reciprocity. I guess the office itself doesn't really have a stance. We would remain neutral. But if it would be up to the lawmakers, of course, as you're discussing, to create legislation to allow for reciprocity. And if they did, then, we would certainly carry that out.
And Crystal, I had a quick question also about the list of conditions. Earlier in the year, I believe it may have even been at the March meeting last year, the board passed the recommendation to add that line to the list of conditions that said, or any other serious medical condition, a licensed or a certified practitioner feels the patient could benefit from cannabis. Now, it's my understanding that that change doesn't require legislative action. And I'm just curious to see, because I've looked on the website and so far the language has not been updated. And, I've spoken with a few doctors that they're still not aware of that, that the board moved on that. So I'm just curious where we are with that recommendation, with that process.
Actually, that does require a legislative change to the Medical Cannabis Act, because those conditions are listed in the act under the definition of serious medical condition.
I was under the impression that would happen through a DHHR rules bundle, that could happen through the rules making process without a separate standalone bill from the legislature. I could be wrong, but that's the way that the statute was explained to me.
I thought something, and I also thought something was introduced, but I'm not sure what the status of that is right now. I know nothing is moving really for medical cannabis, but I think something was introduced to add that language.
Okay. Thank you. I'll check in on that.
Okay.
So I guess where we are is we'd like, at our next subgroup meeting to get a report with respect to reciprocity from the office about what other states do. And then we're going to take up impairment, and we'll invite the state police, someone from Colonel Cahill's office, and if there's any other speakers that Rusty, Joe, or any of us think that might be beneficial for that, I'm happy to spend as much time as we need to let people talk on that topic. We do that there. We'll table the health facilities discussion for now. Is there anything else anyone wants to address at this meeting before we ask? I know we have a number of public members, and it's always my view that we ought to let people make comments briefly. We have it's 5:45. I know some of us need to have another meeting starting at 6:30, so we can't take a ton of time, but I definitely would like to hear from any public people that are here about the discussion we've had tonight, or anything else that they want us to be aware of. But before we do that, Joe, do you have anything else?
No, I think the direction we're taking is good.
Rusty, what about you?
I agree.
All right, well, let's open it up. Anyone that wants to speak to us, I'd ask you keep your comments to a minute or less and just type into the chat feature that you want to talk, and then I'll call on you, okay? Maybe nobody wants to speak.
See, Kevin has got his hand raised.
Oh, okay, maybe I didn't see that. I'm sorry. Kevin, do you want to say something?
Hey, good evening. Coming from the industry standpoint of things, I feel reciprocity is something that we have to address. And numbers are low. It's one of the reasons why there's a slow rollout. We're Washington, D.C. accepts any medical card in the country. So New Mexico is another state. They accept any medical card in the country. I'll give you a perfect example. I was just at the cannabis shop in Williamstown today and walked right in. There might have been 3 people in there. So 2 miles down the road, I drive to Ohio, and Columbia Care has a shop right there in Marietta. Must have been 20 people standing outside waiting in line to get in. So those are customers that could have just come right across to the cannabis shop in Williamstown, and instead, we're losing money there. We're not talking about John Doe and Joe Schmo that's sneaking off to the car and getting high in the parking lot. We're talking about patients that are certified from their state as medical cannabis patients who go through all the regs that we do to certify patients. And I don't see why we can't just have a simple legislation saying West Virginia accepts medical cannabis cards from any state with an active medical cannabis program, period. That would help us out tremendously in the industry. Thank you.
Hey, Kevin, could you just state, because we're in the meeting, to make sure we have it clear, what is your role with the industry?
We've got 3 medical dispensaries that we're opening up. One in Charleston, one in Cross Lanes, and one in Huntington.
I'll tell you too, I know we've asked the Office of Medical Cannabis to put some data together for us. I'm sure, at least my view from the subgroup would be, if anyone from industry has any information on what other states do with reciprocity or anything that you think might be helpful for our discussion for this, feel free to provide it. I mean, those are things that, at least from my view, we want to make this operational to help patients, but in order to do that, we've got to help industry or there's nothing to operate. So, if there's something that you want us to look at that might help our discussion with the full board about making these recommendations, feel free to provide it. You can do that through the Office of Medical Cannabis and they'll get it to the board members.
Yeah, appreciate it. And I keep in touch with growers too. And, the growers are, they're on the same page as I am. The industry is, the Office of Medical Cannabis is, got to help the industry out. And I think the reciprocity agreement is something that, like Rusty said, is a no-brainer. It's going to help the West Virginia industry out, especially if West Virginia would accept medical cannabis cards from any state, that would automatically help us out. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, even tourism coming in here, it's a lot of money. So just think about that.
Thank you. Let's go to, is it Lauren Florio?
Yeah, Lauren Florio. Hi, how are you?
Hi.
Hi. So I totally agree with Rusty, what he was saying earlier about how this needs to happen like as soon as possible and can't necessarily wait a ton of time for patients. And the reciprocity agreements that we could be having with other states that could both help the patients immensely and also bring in revenue to the state. And things also like the edible cannabis, even going into like rights of patients and workers and things like that, like any of those type of things can both like increase the industry, but also help the patients at this moment. So I think that also implementation of the drug regulation experts that they have in other states, and Pennsylvania actually has them. They have a nice little map that shows you who's actually close to this area too. So if you guys wanted to invite them to the next, information session, those might be really good resources too to talk to and possibly implement our own program in the state.
Thank you. And, just to kind of follow up on something you touched on there with wanting to move quickly, I'd encourage anyone that wants to see this change, just to make sure everyone understands, we're an advisory board. And I think everybody knows that, but I always like to express it, because ultimately our power is just to make recommendations, and the legislature's got to change the law for most of this. Some of this can be changed through a legislature, through a rulemaking process with DHHR, but the majority of the things that we're talking about have to come through a legislative change. And so, if there's something that people feel strongly about, talk to your legislators, reach out, because while our recommendations are important, they are the ones that enact the law, and they can work to change the law regardless of whether we've made that specific recommendation or not. So I just encourage people that, don't feel like you should stop with whatever you're, passionate about or care about with our board. We're happy to hear it. We want to make the right recommendations, and we have, the time to kind of study these things. But, if you want instant change, or you want to affect change, make sure you're talking to all the different avenues, and that includes the legislature. Thanks. I think the next was Missy Roberts.
Good evening. I'm a new medical cannabis patient, and while waiting on product to become available over the last year, I started doing some online research and ran into a large group from Illinois that really has likely changed the face of cannabis in that state, because I still feel like it's a little bit hush hush here. You don't want to openly say I am a medical patient because it's so new, but I would love to see something happen in this state too. And I know some of the dispensaries have been working on this, but maybe, to get the word out a little better, they do a lot of work on using the products from the dispensaries to make into things that could work better for each individual person. There's a lot of do-it-yourself and a lot of education being passed around that I don't see happening here yet. That's all.
Thank you for the comments, and I appreciate those. Let's see. I think the next person I see is Jeremy Usted. Dr. Usted.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks for letting me comment. So my name is Dr. Husted. I'm an assistant professor at WVU Medicine. I specialize in addiction treatment, and I'm also the president of the West Virginia Addiction Society of Addiction Medicine. I think the one concern I hear about all this is I hear industry, and I hear tourism, and I hear more money, and I hear that. And that, to me, that is completely contrary to what the purpose of this law was, which was to provide medical treatment for people that are dying of subscribed illnesses. When I hear things like Rusty saying, for any condition that a doctor might say it should be used for, I mean, that's kind of insanity to me when you think about it. I mean, medical cannabis is the only treatment where you have the cure before you have the disease. So it only takes a Google search to see, 100% guarantee to get your medical cannabis card. So we need to ask ourselves, I mean, who are getting these cards at times? And if we're simply going to just hand out cards to everybody, what are we doing here? Are we treating people that really need it? Or are we trying to drum up tax revenue or increase tourism, whatever? And that's, to me, the concern about this reciprocity stuff. I mean, lest we forget, this is still a federally banned DEA Schedule I substance. There is a thing called interstate commerce that makes this illegal going over states. So there is concerns. And again, if we are going to treat it like medicine, which, at times I hear it say, yeah, we're going to treat it like medicine. Other times it's like, well, we don't want to deal with the implications of calling it a medicine. Any kind of thing that kind of holds it back. We don't want it if it's, if it has to do with medicine. But if we're going to call it medicine, we need to treat it as such. And impairment is a real thing. If you go to Colorado, there's more ER visits from impaired driving than alcohol anymore, from marijuana. And I think, speaking about, okay, so one person's impairment level might be different based on their weight or size or whatever. I mean, the same is also true for alcohol. So I have seen plenty of people that are visibly intoxicated, not visibly intoxicated, but they're intoxicated as per the law. They're above 0.8, but they look stone cold sober. So you do have to have clear cutoffs of what is considered impairment and what is not considered impairment, because it's just too subjective. So just some things to think about. And again, I would just caution this approach that suddenly we go from a medical perspective to now it's all about the industry and how can we make them money, because that's not the purpose of this law. And I don't think the legislators would agree with this approach if they're hearing what we're talking about now. Thank you.
Appreciate your comments. I would just say one thing that we've, as a board, been cognizant of since we were charged with this when the law was first passed, is the fact that there's an industry component to all of this. I mean, that we can't. There is no way to help patients, which the legislature has decided we should do with these cannabis products. There is no way to do that without having some kind of effective industry in place. But I hear your concerns and appreciate your comments. With respect to impairment and respect to all these issues. I mean, look, this is a very new field for the entire country, and it's older in some places than others, but it's brand new for West Virginia. Even though the law was passed 5 years ago, we're just now seeing it rolled out, and these are things we've got to address and deal with. So it's important to have viewpoints from all sides and to take those things into account. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we make recommendations, and the legislature and the DHHR are the final say on those things. So appreciate that. Is there any other members of the public that are on the chat or on the Zoom here that would like to speak? I see there's some chat comments, obviously, that are there that can be read. I don't think there's anyone else that's asked for an opportunity to speak. Joe or Rusty, is there anything else you want to say before we conclude the meeting, or anything else you want to talk about?
No, just to address one of the comments in there. It says DHHR needs to get the ball rolling. So legislature sees there are people out here that care and need better access and force them to move with it. I want to point out the fact that the DHHR and the Office of Medical Cannabis, when the Medical Cannabis Act was passed, they were handed a garbage sandwich, and they're expected to make it taste good. A lot of these changes require legislative action. Most of the changes to get this program where it needs to be does require legislative action. So I would just echo Jesse's comments from earlier. If you believe in medical cannabis and you believe in this program and you want to see it work, call your lawmakers and open up the lines of communication with the folks that represent you in Charleston. That's what it's going to take to get this where it needs to be. So, I just want to, because I hear from patients every day, and there's a very strong sentiment that the Office of Medical Cannabis and the DHHR is just dropping the ball. And I personally don't feel that that's an accurate way of looking at it. Again, they can only operate within the parameters of the statute. And, I feel like they're doing all they can with what they were given to work with. So in order to change the parameters and to change that statute, it's going to require legislative actions. So call your lawmakers. You got 5 minutes, call them, email them, do it every day, call them so frequently that they know your voice when they answer the phone. And hopefully we can apply enough pressure to get them to do the right thing by patients and stop pushing all of this reefer madness nonsense that, seems to be dominating the conversation in West Virginia.
Yeah, just to, follow up with that, any viewpoint you have. I mean, the legislature is the ones that ultimately make the changes, as Rusty said. So whatever your viewpoints are on this, if you want to, you have the right to talk to your legislators or talk to the legislators that are down here in Charleston right now. Reach out and do it. They're easy to find. You can get online and find the public phone numbers at the State House to get a hold of them and call. And there's email addresses listed there. So, Joe, anything you want to add?
No, I think we're good. I think we're good. Glad that people had the chance to make good comments.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Appreciate everybody getting on here and taking the time. I guess that's going to conclude the meeting then. I don't see anyone else with their hands up. So
Just,
we're gonna.
one last thing, Jesse, I'm sorry. Rusty, I did verify with Jason, the condition, it does have to go in the act. So it does require legislation. The bill was introduced, but did not make it out of the committee.
Gotcha.
The only thing that we can do via rule, which was done, was add the dry leaf. So.
Gotcha. Thank you for the clarification.
And that's something that, as we're saying here, I mean, this is, we are an advisory board. We can't change the law. And so that's something that even a recommendation like that we've already made has to go to the legislature, and they have to take it up and then make a decision that they're going to amend the law. So that's why it's important not just to reach out to this board. It's still important to reach out to this board because we spend more time talking about this than any other group around the state, and we can make recommendations that oftentimes are listened to. But at the end of the day, no matter what your feelings are, if you want the law changed to allow more access, you want the law changed the other way, whatever your feelings are, reach out to the legislators. All right, with that, I think we're going to conclude the meeting here tonight. I appreciate everybody coming and everyone's time. Wednesday, hey, Crystal, can you tell everybody when the full board meeting is, the next full board meeting?
It is March, I think it's, let me get to my calendar, March 17th at noon.
March 17th at noon. And if there's any members of the public on here, they can, that will be posted and they can get access to that. That meeting will be virtual as well, is my understanding, but there's a way to get access.
Focus will be on home growth.
Right.
That meeting.
All right. So we'll be back for that full board meeting on March 17th. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jesse. Y'all have a good evening.
You too.